At 32, Rachel Mercer buried her father and lost the family repair shop 6 weeks later when creditors came to take it. With no business, little money, and only her father's dog Finn beside her, Rachel thought Daniel Mercer had left her nothing but debts until she found paperwork for a forgotten logging camp deep in the Oregon mountains that she could claim for just $10.
Everyone who knew Alder Creek thought the decision was ridiculous. The cabins were rotting, the workshop was collapsing, and one local told Rachel the forest had been swallowing the place for decades. But she paid the $10 anyway. Then a fallen tree blocked the only road out, leaving Rachel stranded at the abandoned camp. The next morning,
Finn began digging furiously beside the old workshop. His paws struck metal. Rachel cleared away the wet soil and uncovered a rusted steel toolbox buried beneath the roots. She forced it open, and what she found inside revealed that her grandfather had protected something far more valuable than the camp itself. But before we discover what was inside, tell me in the comments,
where are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are. And if you enjoy forgotten places, family mysteries, and second chances, subscribe to the channel. Now, let's go back to the day Rachel lost her father's shop.
6 weeks after Daniel Mercer died, Rachel stood beneath the fluorescent lights of Mercer Repair and watched strangers put inventory stickers on everything her father had spent 30 years building. The hydraulic lift, welding equipment, tool cabinets, even the battered office desk were now collateral being collected against loans Daniel had secured with the property.
Rachel had spent weeks calling lenders, calculating payments, and trying to keep the shop alive. None of it had been enough.
"We'll need the building cleared by 5, the creditor's representative said. Rachel nodded because speaking felt dangerous. Finn waited beside the open bay door, watching her with the same patient brown eyes that had followed Daniel around the shop every morning.
The Border Collie mix still looked toward the office whenever someone entered, as though expecting Daniel to appear with coffee in one hand and a wrench in the other. Rachel wished she could still expect that too. Instead, she climbed a stepladder and removed the wooden sign above the office door. Mercer Repair. Her father had carved it himself when Rachel was 9. She remembered sitting on the workbench while he painted the letters blue. Now she carried it to her pickup and laid it carefully behind the seat. Grief had been easier when it was only grief. Lately, anger had joined it. Daniel had taught her to change bearings before she could drive, to never return a machine with a loose bolt, and to pay every bill before buying something she wanted. Yet he had died leaving loans large enough to take the shop. "You were supposed to have a plan," she whispered. Finn climbed into the passenger seat. By late afternoon, almost everything Rachel was allowed to keep fit into the pickup: clothes, personal tools, Daniel's papers, Finn's food, and the old sign. She had little money left and nowhere permanent to store much else. Before leaving, she sat behind the wheel and opened the last cardboard box from Daniel's office. Most of it was useless now: insurance notices, equipment manuals, old receipts. Near the bottom was a yellow envelope containing documents she had never seen. Across the first page were the words, "Alder Creek Logging Camp." Rachel frowned. The property was outside Millhaven, Oregon, deep in the Cascade Mountains. The papers described an old purchase right connected to Walter Hale, Rachel's grandfather. Daniel had apparently maintained that right after Walter's death. One figure made Rachel reread the page. Transfer price $10. $10 for a logging camp, she murmured. Finn tilted his head. Sounds promising, doesn't it? She nearly put the documents back. A forgotten camp in the mountains was the last thing she needed. Then she noticed pencil marks along the margin in Daniel's handwriting. Don't judge it before you see it. Rachel stared at the sentence.
Even dead, her father seemed to be asking her to trust one more decision she didn't understand. She called the number listed on the latest notice.
A property administrator confirmed the purchase right was valid but nearing expiration. If Rachel wanted Alder Creek, she would need to complete the transfer within days. "What exactly am I buying?" she asked. "Old logging property, several structures from what the records show. It hasn't operated in decades." "So why $10? "It's a contractual transfer amount tied to the existing purchase right. I can explain the paperwork when you arrive." Rachel looked through the windshield at Mercer Repair. Staying here would not bring the shop back. $10 was small enough to sound meaningless, but with her finances, even $10 deserved thought. Still, Daniel had kept these papers for a reason. "I'll come tomorrow," she said. "I want to see it." "Then come through Millhaven first. We'll handle the transfer there." The man paused. "And, Ms. Mercer?" "Yes, if you go up to Alder Creek, don't trust the old logging road after dark." Rachel reached Millhaven shortly before noon, after hours of wet highway and mountain roads bordered by dark Douglas firs. The town was smaller than she expected, built along a river beneath low, gray clouds. Finn pressed his nose to the passenger window as she parked outside the property office. Inside, Rachel signed 6 pages, listened to an explanation of taxes and access rights, then placed a $10 bill on the desk. She almost laughed when the administrator handed her the transfer documents. Yesterday, she had lost a repair shop worth more than everything she owned. Today, for $10, she owned an abandoned logging camp. "That's really it?" she asked. "Legally, yes." He gave her an old map. "Practically, I make no promises." Rachel stopped at a hardware store for basic supplies before asking the clerk about Alder Creek. The man looked up sharply. "That place, I just bought it. Why?" Rachel smiled without humor. "Still working that out." Near the counter, an older man setting down a chainsaw chain turned toward her. He introduced himself as Eli Turner. He was 64, broad-shouldered despite his age, with hands permanently marked by grease and old cuts. "Alder Creek hasn't run since before you were born," he said. "My grandfather managed it. Walter Hale." Eli's expression changed. "Walter Hale was your grandfather? You knew him?" "Knew of him." The answer came too quickly. Rachel waited, but Eli picked up his purchase. "You heading there now?" "That was the plan." He glanced through the window at the thickening clouds. "I'll follow you up. Road gets confusing past the old spur." Rachel almost refused. Then she remembered the warning about the logging road and accepted. The pavement ended several miles outside Millhaven. Beyond it, potholes and wet leaves covered a narrow track climbing through dense forest. Alder Creek finally appeared behind a rusted gate hanging open on one hinge. Rachel stopped the pickup. Cabins leaned beneath moss-covered roofs. A long mess hall stood among young trees that had grown where open ground once existed. Beyond it were a collapsing saw shed and a workshop with weathered plank walls. "This is mine?" Rachel asked. Eli stepped beside her. "What's left of it?" Finn jumped down and immediately began investigating the clearing. Eli pointed toward the roofs and drainage channels, listing problems with uncomfortable efficiency. "You didn't buy a logging camp. You bought what the forest hasn't swallowed yet. Everyone hear this encouraging? Only when there's reason." They entered the workshop. Rusted brackets remained on the walls where tools had once hung. Rachel ran her hand over a heavy workbench scarred by decades of use. Near one corner, letters had been carved into the wood. W.H. Walter Hale. She traced them with her thumb. She had few memories of her grandfather, but suddenly the camp felt less anonymous. An engine approached outside. A dark pickup stopped near the gate, and a man in a clean rain jacket crossed the clearing. Gavin Cole. He said, I own timberland east of here. Heard Alder Creek transferred today. News traveled quickly in Millhaven. Gavin looked over the camp before making Rachel a straightforward offer for the property. The amount was not enormous, but after losing Mercer Repair, it was enough to matter. Enough for rent, breathing room, perhaps a start somewhere else. Why buy this? Rachel asked. Land, access, maybe salvage what's useful. He glanced toward the cabins. Certainly not for the buildings. Rachel thought of Daniel's penciled note. Don't judge it before you see it. I'm not deciding today. Gavin handed her a card. Fair enough. Offer stands for now. After he left, Eli checked one cabin and judged it dry enough for a night if Rachel insisted on staying. He showed her how to secure the old wood stove, then prepared to return to town before dark. Come down in the morning if the weather turns, he said. Rachel watched his truck disappear among the trees. The camp became startlingly quiet. She carried in a sleeping bag, food, water, and a few personal tools. Finn ate beside the cabin while Rachel sat on the step and looked toward the workshop. She could sell. That was the sensible choice. $10 could become enough money to begin again. Yet the initials carved into the workbench kept returning to her thoughts. Daniel had held on to Alder Creek for years. She wanted at least one night to understand why. As dusk settled, Finn wandered toward the workshop. Rachel called him once. He ignored her. His nose moved rapidly over the wet ground beside the wall. Then he stopped near a patch of earth, tangled with exposed roots. He sniffed, circled, and began scraping at the soil. Finn, leave it. The dog dug harder. Dirt flew between his hind legs. Rachel walked over and caught his collar, pulling him back. Finn immediately strained toward the same spot. Rachel aimed her flashlight at the shallow hole. She saw nothing but black soil and roots. Whatever it is can wait until morning. She led him toward the cabin. Finn followed reluctantly, looking back twice at the disturbed ground beside Walter Hale's old workshop. Rachel woke to Finn scratching at the cabin door. Gray morning light filled the single dirty window, and rain tapped softly against the roof. I know, she muttered, pulling on her boots. You've got unfinished business. The moment she opened the door, Finn ran across the clearing toward the workshop. He stopped exactly where he had dug the night before and began pawing at the wet earth. Rachel followed with a shovel she had found leaning inside the workshop. Move. Finn reluctantly stepped aside. The first few inches were mostly mud and roots. Rachel cut through them carefully, wondering why she was spending her morning digging a hole beside a building she might sell within days. Then the shovel struck something with a dull metallic clang. Finn barked. Rachel crouched and scraped dirt away with her gloved hands. A flat, rusted surface appeared beneath the roots. Okay, she whispered. You found something. She widened the hole until she could see the outline of a rectangular steel box. It had been buried deep enough that soil covered the lid completely. One thick root had grown across a corner. Rachel cut it with a handsaw, then worked the shovel beneath the box. It took several attempts before she pulled it free. The steel toolbox landed heavily beside the hole. Rain began falling harder. Rachel dragged the box into the workshop while Finn followed, tail moving with satisfaction. The toolbox was old, dented, and heavily rusted around the hinges. Its latch was secured by a small padlock. Rachel tried pulling it once, then smiled despite herself. Dad would be embarrassed if I let that stop me. She retrieved a pry bar and penetrating oil from her pickup. After several minutes of working the corroded latch, the lock finally snapped loose. Rachel lifted the lid. There was no money inside, no jewelry, no obvious treasure. Instead,
Several bundles of paper had been wrapped in oilcloth and packed tightly around a small notebook. Rachel touched the nearest bundle. The wrapping had kept most of the moisture away. She carried everything to Walter's workbench before opening the first packet. Payroll slips, names, dates, hours worked, dollar amounts. Rachel frowned and opened another. More records. Dozens of workers appeared across the pages. Some had job descriptions beside their names. Faller, Sawyer, mechanic, truck driver. You dug up accounting records, she told Finn. He sneezed and lay beneath the bench. Rain hammered the workshop roof now, and drops began slipping through gaps in the boards. Rachel quickly moved the papers away from a leak and covered the remaining bundles with her jacket. She called Eli. Finn found something buried beside the workshop. What kind of something? An old steel toolbox full of payroll records. There was a pause. Don't let those papers get wet. I'm coming up. Elle arrived less than an hour later, carrying a plastic storage tub and several dry towels. The moment he saw the toolbox, he stopped. You recognize it? Rachel asked. Eli ran his hand across the rusted lid. Near one side, beneath the corrosion, were two faint stamped letters. W.H. That belonged to Walter. Rachel looked from the initials to the workbench. You're sure? I saw him carry one like this when I was young. Could be the same one. Together they moved the records into the plastic tub while Rachel examined the notebook. Walter's handwriting filled the pages with dates, names, and figures. It looked like a second payroll ledger, but less formal. Why bury this? Rachel asked. If it was ordinary paperwork, why not leave it in the office? Elle had no answer. Rachel turned another page. A word appeared beside one worker's name in block letters, Pertutted. She turned forward. The word appeared again beside another name, Pertucted, then again. Some entries contained only hours and amounts. Others had dates written beside the word. Protected from what? Rachel asked. Eli leaned closer. His face became serious. Rachel began reading the names aloud. Most meant nothing to her. Harold Briggs, Samuel Ortiz, Frank Turner. Eli's hand suddenly settled on the notebook. Stop. Rachel looked up. What? His eyes remained fixed on the page. Frank Turner. Relative. Eli did not answer immediately. Outside, rain ran from the workshop roof in silver sheets. Rachel looked again at the entry. Frank Turner had worked 47 hours during the listed week. A dollar amount appeared beside his name, followed by the same word written beside several others. Protected. Who was he? Rachel asked. Eli pulled a chair toward the workbench and sat down slowly. Whatever uncertainty he had shown when Rachel first mentioned Walter Hale was gone now. My father. Rachel glanced at the toolbox Finn had pulled from the Oregon earth, then back at Eli. Your father worked here? For years. Then maybe you know what these records mean. Eli stared at Frank Turner's name for several seconds. No, he said quietly. Then he looked at the remaining bundles still wrapped in oilcloth. But my father's name should be in there. Rachel and Eli spent the rest of the morning sorting the records across Walter's workbench. Finn slept underneath while rain drummed against the workshop roof. Frank Turner appeared more than once. Each entry listed hours, expected wages, and sometimes the word protected. Eli touched one of the pages carefully. Dad never talked much about the end of Alder Creek. He said, what did he tell you? That work slowed down. Then one day there wasn't any more. He remembered his father coming home worried during those final months, while his mother stretched groceries and postponed bills. Frank eventually found another logging job, but the family rarely spoke about Alder Creek afterward. Walter Rachel asked, your father ever mention him? Sometimes,
Never enough to explain this.
Rachel photographed the most fragile pages before wrapping them again, if these records mattered. She wanted copies somewhere safer than a leaking workshop. By noon, the rain had weakened enough for them to drive into Millhaven. Eli directed her to the library, where Sophie Nguyen managed both the public collection and the town's small historical archive. Sophie listened as Rachel explained the buried toolbox, then examined the photographs rather than risk handling the originals unnecessarily. "Payroll records can tell you more than people expect," she said, "especially when a company fails." She pulled old newspapers and local business files from storage. Rachel and Eli worked beside her for nearly 2 hours. The story emerged in fragments. Alder Creek had once employed dozens of people around Millhaven. Then timber orders declined. A newspaper clipping reported reduced shifts. Another mentioned delayed payments to suppliers. Several weeks later came a short article announcing that operations had ceased indefinitely. "That's it?" Rachel asked. "A whole camp closes and gets 3 paragraphs?" Sophie shrugged. "Small businesses disappear quietly all the time." Eli found another clipping mentioning workers waiting for overdue wages. His jaw tightened. Dad had a family to feed. Sophie compared the date with Walter's notebook. "Look, Frank Turner's entry appeared during the same period. So did Harold Briggs, Samuel Ortiz, and more than a dozen others. Each had specific dollar amounts beside their names." Rachel felt the mystery narrowing. "These are wages they were owed." "Looks that way," Sophie said. "But we need something official to compare against." She located archived payroll material associated with the camp's final operating period. The figures were incomplete, but enough survived to show the problem. Several workers had hours recorded normally. Their payment column read 0. Rachel leaned closer. Paid $0. Eli found Frank's name. 47 hours. Payment 0. "So he never got paid?" Rachel asked. Eli stared at the line. "If he didn't, he never told me." Rachel opened Walter's notebook beside the official record. Frank's 47 hours were there too, along with an exact amount and one handwritten word. Protected. Sophie frowned. Walter was keeping a separate accounting? Why, Rachel asked. That's what we don't know. The rain had strengthened again when Rachel and Eli returned to Alder Creek. Mud filled the deeper ruts in the logging road, and Rachel's pickup slid once before regaining traction. Near the camp, runoff crossed the road in shallow brown streams. "Another day of this, and access gets ugly," Eli warned. At the workshop, they moved the toolbox farther from the leaking wall and placed the records inside the plastic tub. Rachel was covering it when an engine sounded outside. Gavin Cole stepped from his pickup wearing a rain shell. "Road's deteriorating," he said. "Thought I'd check whether you reconsidered." "You drove up here just for that?" "I'm interested in the property." His eyes moved toward the workshop, but not the records. "And every storm makes these buildings more expensive to deal with." He repeated his offer. Rachel could not deny its appeal. Yesterday the camp had seemed useless. Today it had become complicated, which was not the same as valuable. "I'm still not ready." Gavin nodded toward the trees. "Then don't wait too long. Land doesn't care about family history." After he left, Eli checked the road conditions while Rachel returned to the workbench. She arranged Walter's notebook beside the copied payroll pages. The contradiction was stark. Official records said Frank Turner and multiple others had received nothing. Walter's private ledger preserved the exact money owed to each man. And beside many of those same names, Walter had deliberately written "protected." Rachel traced the word without touching the faded ink. "Maybe it means their jobs were protected," she said. Eli shook his head. "Camp closed. Nobody's job was protected." "Insurance. Not that I ever heard." Rachel checked the dates again.
The records offered no explanation, only the same impossible pairing repeated across worker after worker, unpaid wages on one side, Walter's careful accounting on the other. Outside, rain hammered the roof harder, and Finn lifted his head at the sound. Rachel looked at Frank Turner's official payroll line. Paid. Then she looked at Walter's notebook. Protective. If those men had never been paid, what exactly had her grandfather protected? The rain continued through the night, rattling the cabin roof and waking Rachel more than once. By morning, the clearing had become a patchwork of puddles and mud. She carried Walter's notebook into the workshop and returned to the dates marked protected. Something she had missed before became obvious. Several were dated after the newspapers reported closure of Alder Creek.
Frank Turner's was one of them. You were still doing something here,
Rachel murmured, looking at Walter's initials carved into the workbench. Finn paced near the doorway, restless after being kept inside by the rain. Rachel photographed another page and tried calling Sophie, but the signal faded before the call connected. She decided to drive into Millhaven while the weather allowed it. She packed the most important records into the plastic tub, secured the cabin, and started down the logging road. Finn rode beside her. They had gone less than a mile when Rachel rounded a bend and hit the brakes. A Douglas fir lay across the road. Its trunk was wider than her chest, its crown buried in the opposite ditch. Fresh earth clung to exposed roots where wind and saturated ground had torn the tree free. Rachel got out and stared at it. Of course. She walked along the trunk, looking for a gap. There was none large enough for the pickup. The slope on one side was too steep to drive around, and thick trees blocked the other. Her small handsaw was useless against a trunk this size. Rachel climbed onto the pickup's running board until her phone caught one weak bar and called Eli. Trees down across the road. How big? Big enough to own the road now. Eli asked where she was, then sighed. Stay at camp. I'll arrange equipment from this side. But with roads like this, it may take time. Rachel looked at the wall of wet forest around her. So I'm stuck. Temporarily. Back at Alder Creek, she focused on practical problems. The cabin had a wood stove, but she needed light to examine records after dark. An old portable generator sat beneath a lean-to behind the workshop. It would start, sputter, then die. Rachel removed the fuel line, cleaned the clogged filter, checked the plug, and adjusted the carburetor. Her hands moved automatically through steps Daniel had taught her years ago. Fuel, air, spark. She heard him saying in memory, "Machines usually tell you what they're missing if you stop being mad long enough to listen." On the fourth attempt, the generator caught and kept running. A single work light flickered on inside the workshop. Rachel stood listening to the engine settle into a steady rhythm. For the first time since losing Mercer, fixing something felt good rather than painful. Daniel had lost the shop, but he had not taken away what he taught her. That realization softened something in Rachel she was not ready to name. With the road blocked and little else she could do, she returned to Walter's records. She arranged the final weeks of payroll chronologically. Workers were owed money, Alder Creek closed, yet Walter continued making entries afterward. Protected appeared beside names on different dates, almost as though each case had been resolved separately. Rachel searched the toolbox again. Beneath the oilcloth bundles was a narrow packet she had overlooked. Inside were receipts from the camp's final months. Most concerned fuel, replacement parts, and supplies. One document was different. It recorded the sale of logging equipment after operations had ceased, 2 loaders, a truck, several saws, and other machinery. Rachel checked the signature at the bottom. Walter Hale. The amount was substantial. She pulled Walter's notebook closer and began adding the unpaid wages. Her first total was wrong. She calculated again, slower this time. Then she sat back.
The amount raised through the equipment sale was remarkably close to the total payroll still owed to the workers listed in Walter's private records. Finn rested beneath the workbench while rain ticked against the roof. Rachel stared from the sale receipt to the names marked "Protected." Maybe the money had gone to creditors. Maybe there was another explanation. But a possibility had formed, and once it did, she could not make herself ignore it. Walter had kept precise records of what each worker was owed. He had continued making notes after Alder Creek closed. Then he had signed paperwork selling equipment for almost the same amount as the missing payroll. Rachel touched the edge of the receipt. "You sold the equipment," she whispered. She looked again at Frank Turner's name and the word beside it, "Protected." Until now. Rachel had assumed Walter buried those records because he wanted to hide something. Sitting in the abandoned workshop with the road blocked by a fallen tree and her grandfather's papers spread before her, she considered the opposite possibility. Maybe Walter had buried them because he wanted proof preserved. And maybe the money from that equipment had never disappeared at all. Maybe her grandfather had used it to pay the workers. The road was still blocked the next morning. Rachel climbed onto the pickup's running board until her phone found enough signal to send Eli a message, then returned to the workshop before the rain strengthened again. The generator ran unevenly but held. She rationed the fuel, switching the work light off whenever she did not need it. The cabin roof had begun leaking near one corner, so she moved her sleeping bag, placed a dented bucket beneath the drip, and covered the toolbox records with plastic before returning to Walter's notebook. Sophie managed to send several photographs of archived documents before the signal disappeared again. One showed Alder Creek's closure filings. Another showed authorization allowing Walter to oversee the sale of certain company equipment during liquidation. Rachel compared the dates with the receipt she had found. The equipment sale was legitimate. The money existed. What bothered her was what came next. According to the family property records Sophie had located, none of that money appeared later as part of Walter Hale's personal assets. There was no sudden land purchase, no large savings account, no evidence that he had carried the proceeds home. Rachel stared at the figures until irritation replaced curiosity. So where did it go? Finn lifted his head beneath the bench, because if he had that kind of money and still left the family struggling, that's not exactly noble. The words sounded harsher aloud. She thought of Daniel. Her father had also known how to work, how to repair things, how to help customers who could not always pay on time. None of that had prevented Mercer Repair from being taken. Rachel had spent 6 weeks wondering how someone so practical could leave behind such a mess. Now Walter seemed to be repeating the same pattern from another generation. Her phone rang with Eli's name. "Crew can't reach the tree until tomorrow at the earliest," he said. "How are you holding up?" "Fine." Rachel looked at the bucket catching water in the cabin doorway. "Mostly." She told him what Sophie had found and what the records did not show. Walter sold equipment. The money vanishes. His family doesn't get it. Sound familiar? Eli was silent. Rachel. Maybe everyone keeps turning bad decisions into family legends because it feels better. You don't know what he did yet. Neither do you. The reply came too quickly, but Rachel was tired, cold, and angry at 2 dead men who had left her to sort through consequences. Eli's voice hardened. "I know what my father used to say," Rachel paused, "about Walter. Not often, but there was one thing." Rain tapped harder against the workshop roof. He said, "Walter made sure we didn't leave empty-handed." Rachel stopped moving. "What does that mean?" "I never asked. I was a kid. By the time I cared, Dad was gone." "You're only telling me this now?" "Because until yesterday, I didn't know it mattered." Eli exhaled.
Don't decide what Walter did before you finish reading what he left. The call dropped a few seconds later. Rachel stood with the phone in her hand, irritated partly because Eli had said exactly what Daniel had written on the transfer paper. Don't judge it before you see it. She went back to the toolbox. The bottom was lined with oilcloth that had stiffened with age. Rachel lifted one corner and felt something underneath. A thin envelope had been flattened against the steel. Inside were small paper receipts, each folded separately. She opened the first. A worker's name appeared at the top. Beneath it was an amount matching Walter's notebook almost exactly. At the bottom, beside a signature, were 3 typed words: "Received in full." Rachel opened another.
Different worker, different amount, received in full. Then another. Her heartbeat accelerated. These were not company payroll slips. They looked like acknowledgments made after the closure. She searched for Frank Turner. His receipt was halfway through the stack. Frank's signature crossed the bottom in faded blue ink. The amount matched the wages Walter had recorded beside his 47 hours. Received in full. Rachel sat down hard on the chair. Eli's father had been paid. The official records said 0. Walter's private records said otherwise. She checked the equipment sale total again. It could have covered a large portion of the missing payroll. But Rachel still did not know whether the sale alone explained everything. She did know one thing now. Walter had not simply watched the money disappear. He had tracked each worker individually until someone signed that the debt was settled. Rainwater began dripping faster into the cabin bucket. The generator sputtered once, warning her that fuel was running low. Rachel should have gone to deal with both problems, but she remained at the workbench with Frank Turner's receipt in her hand. The word "protected" no longer felt abstract. It was connected to real money, real hours, and real families waiting for wages they had earned. Rachel looked at the faded signature again. If Frank Turner had been paid after Alder Creek closed, then Walter had found a way to make that happen, and the first proof was sitting in her hand. By late morning, the rain had eased enough for Rachel to hear machinery working somewhere beyond the trees. An hour later, Eli's truck appeared at the edge of camp behind a county loader that had finally cleared the fallen Douglas fir from the logging road. Finn barked and ran toward him. Rachel met Eli beside the workshop with Frank Turner's receipt already in her hand. "You need to see this." Elle took the paper carefully. His eyes moved across the amount, then stopped at the signature for several seconds. He said nothing. "That's him," he finally said. "You're sure I've seen Dad's signature on enough birthday cards and bank papers?" He traced the faded line without touching it. "That's Frank Turner." Rachel showed him the official payroll page marked "Paid $0." Then Walter's private record and the receipt marked "Received in full." Eli stared at the 3 documents laid beside each other. So he got paid after the camp closed. "Looks that way." Eli sat on the edge of the workbench. "Then that thing he used to say, Walter made sure we didn't leave empty-handed." Eli nodded. The words meant more now. Rachel packed the most important records into the plastic tub and followed Eli down to Millhaven. The road was scarred by mud and fresh tire tracks, but passable again. At the library, Sophie had already gathered several family contacts connected to names in Walter's notebook. She did not give Rachel private details without permission. Instead, she called people herself and explained that records from Alder Creek had been found. One family agreed to speak by phone. Their grandfather had worked as a sawyer. He always said the company folded, owing him nearly a month's wages. His granddaughter told them. Then Walter Hale called him back to the camp a few weeks later. "Did he say why?" Rachel asked. "To pay him." Another family remembered almost the same thing. Their father had believed the money was gone, then received a message to return to Alder Creek. A third recalled that Walter met workers individually rather than calling everyone together.
None knew where the money came from, but every story ended the same way. The men had worked, the company had failed,
and somehow Walter made sure they did not leave with nothing. Eli sat beside Rachel while Sophie wrote notes. "Dad never made Walter sound like a hero," he said. "Maybe Walter didn't want to be one." By afternoon, Rachel felt certain about what happened to the workers. What she still could not prove was how Walter paid them. The equipment sale receipt covered a large portion of the missing payroll, but not all of it. "Stories aren't enough," Rachel said. "If we're saying Walter protected their wages, I want to know exactly how." Sophie agreed and returned to the property archive. While she searched, Rachel stepped outside with Finn. Gavin Cole was waiting near her pickup. "Road open again?" he asked. "Barely." He glanced at the plastic tub visible through the window. "Still chasing old papers?" "They matter, historically maybe." Gavin leaned against his truck. "But history doesn't repair roofs or create road access. Alder Creek is still what it was when I made the offer." Rachel knew he was right in the narrowest sense. The camp had not become more profitable because Walter had paid workers decades ago. Rachel still needed money. Mercer Repair was still gone. "You can preserve whatever records you want after you sell," Gavin said. "You don't need to own 40 acres of problems to remember your grandfather." Rachel looked toward the hills beyond town. "Maybe not." Gavin handed her an updated written offer. "Think about it." She took the paper but did not answer. Back inside, Sophie called her over to a table covered in photocopies. "I found Walter's personal property filings. One document showed that shortly after Alder Creek closed, Walter sold equipment registered in his own name, a service truck, portable mill components, and several pieces of machinery not owned by the company. Another record showed a large withdrawal from his personal savings within the same period." Rachel sat down. "How much?" Sophie turned the calculator toward her. "Combined with the authorized company equipment sale, Walter's personal funds brought the available total within a few dollars of the unpaid payroll listed in his notebook." Rachel recalculated it herself. Then again, the numbers still matched. He used his own money. Sophie nodded cautiously. "That's what the records indicate." Rachel looked at Eli. His expression had changed from curiosity to something quieter. "He could have kept that," Rachel said. "He had a family, too. So did every man on that list." Eli replied. Rachel thought of Walter selling his own truck, drawing down savings, watching a business collapse around him while workers waited for wages they had already earned. He had not protected the company. He had not protected the camp. He had not even protected his own financial future. He had protected the people whose families depended on those paychecks. Rachel looked at the receipts marked "Received in Full" and finally understood why the word in Walter's notebook had been written so deliberately. Protect was not a promise. It was a record of what he had done. And the last piece was now impossible to ignore. Walter Hale had not only saved the evidence, he had spent his own money to make sure the workers were paid. Rachel spent that evening in the small room she had rented above a Millhaven diner, surrounded by papers she had taken from Daniel's last box. Finn slept near the door while rain tapped against the window. For the first time since finding the toolbox, Rachel was no longer asking what Walter had done. She was asking what Daniel had known. She opened folders she had skimmed weeks earlier, when grief and the loss of Mercer Repair had made every document look like another burden. Most held routine records, taxes, insurance, old equipment receipts, correspondence about the shop. Near the bottom was a thin folder labeled Alder Creek. Rachel opened it and found years of letters between Daniel and an estate administrator connected to the property. Daniel had renewed the purchase right repeatedly, sometimes paying small filing fees to keep it active. Rachel frowned.
He had been struggling to keep Mercer Repair afloat, yet he had still spent money preserving a claim to an abandoned logging camp he never used. She read one letter twice. Daniel had been asked whether he intended to harvest timber or sell the land. His handwritten response in the margin was simple. Not yet. Rachel turned another page. A later letter mentioned structural decay at Alder Creek and warned that several buildings might eventually become unsalvageable. Daniel had still renewed the right? Why? Rachel whispered. Finn lifted his head.
The question hurt because Daniel had allowed the shop to become collateral while protecting access to a place Rachel had never even heard him discuss. The next morning, she brought the folder to Sophie. They sat at the same archive table where Walter's payroll records had been spread only a day earlier. Sophie read through the correspondence carefully. "He definitely wanted the option kept alive," she said. "For a long time. Meanwhile, he was borrowing against Mercer Repair." Rachel's voice tightened. "I lost everything because he couldn't keep the shop clear of debt. But somehow this mattered enough to preserve." Sophie looked up. "You're still angry with him." Rachel gave a short laugh. "Is it that obvious? Only because you keep talking about the shop like losing it proves he failed you." Rachel stared at the folder. "Maybe it does." She had not said that aloud to anyone. "He knew how important Mercer Repair was to me. He knew it was all I had left of him. Then I find out he kept this forgotten camp alive while the business fell apart?" Sophie did not argue. "And now I find out Walter gave away money his own family could have used. Apparently the men in my family are very good at losing things for reasons they don't explain." The bitterness faded as soon as she heard herself. Sophie closed the folder gently. "Or maybe you haven't found Daniel's reason yet." Before Rachel could answer, her phone buzzed. Gavin Cole had left a message asking to meet. He arrived at the library parking lot 20 minutes later and handed Rachel a revised offer for Alder Creek. It was his highest yet, enough to settle some immediate expenses, secure housing, and give her time to decide what came after Mercer Repair. "I'm not going higher," Gavin said. "This is the practical number." Rachel read it twice. "You really want the property? I want usable land. You want options. And if I say no, then it's yours, along with every roof, road, tree, and repair bill." He was not threatening her. That almost made the decision harder. Rachel folded the offer and slipped it into her jacket. "I need time. Not much," Gavin said. "I'm moving on another parcel soon." After he left, Rachel returned to the library. Sophie had continued sorting Daniel's folder. "There's something here," she said. A smaller envelope had been tucked between two land documents. Inside were copies of older letters about Walter's records and the condition of the camp. Daniel had apparently asked whether any original payroll material had ever been recovered. The answers were always no. One administrator suggested the old structures be demolished. Daniel had written beside that recommendation, "Not until Rachel knows." Rachel felt her chest tighten. "He wrote my name." Sophie nodded. Beneath that page was a short note in Daniel's handwriting, folded once. Rachel opened it. "Rachel knows how to fix what looks finished." She stared at the sentence. It sounded exactly like something he would have said in the shop after handing her an engine everyone else had given up on. Beneath it was another line. "Tell her what Walter protected." Rachel read both lines again. The room seemed suddenly too quiet. Daniel had known at least enough of Walter's story to understand that Alder Creek mattered. He had not preserved the purchase right because of timber. He had not been waiting for the land to appreciate. He had been protecting access to the place where the truth could still be found. Rachel thought of the $10 transfer, the buried toolbox, the worker records, the receipts, and Walter's missing savings. She had assumed the camp was an inheritance Daniel had forgotten to explain. Now she understood that the low price was never meant to represent Alder Creek's value. It was simply the mechanism that would put the property into her hands. Daniel had kept the door open long enough for Rachel to walk through it. She looked down at his final note, then toward the folded offer from Gavin inside her jacket. For the first time, Rachel understood that the question was no longer whether Alder Creek was worth more than $10. The $10 had only been the way Daniel brought her here. Rachel returned to Alder Creek the next morning with Sophie and Eli. The storm had moved east, leaving the forest wet and strangely bright beneath broken clouds. Finn ran ahead toward the workshop, while Rachel carried Walter's toolbox inside and set it on the scarred workbench beneath the initials W.H. For hours, the three of them arranged copies of every surviving document in chronological order this time. There were no missing pieces large enough to change the story. The company behind Alder Creek had begun failing after timber orders declined. Suppliers went unpaid, payroll was delayed. Then operations stopped, leaving workers with weeks of wages they had already earned but never received. Official payroll records show the result plainly: paid $0. Walter had responded by creating his own record of every outstanding amount he wasn't estimating. Sophie said, comparing the figures, "He copied the hours exactly." Rachel nodded. "Because he needed proof of what each person was owed." Next came the equipment sales. Walter had legal authority to liquidate certain company machinery. That money covered part of the unpaid payroll. When it was not enough, he sold equipment registered personally to him, including his service truck and portable mill components. Then he withdrew most of his savings. Sophie placed the total beside Walter's list. The figures nearly matched to the dollar. Finally came the receipts. One worker after another had signed "Received in full." Frank Turner, Harold Briggs, Samuel Ortiz, men whose families had expected those wages for groceries, rent, heating fuel, and whatever came after Alder Creek. Beside each completed payment, Walter had written the same word in his notebook: protected. Eli held his father's receipt all these years. "I thought Dad meant Walter helped them find work somewhere else." Rachel looked at the signature. "He protected their pay, their families." Eli corrected quietly. That distinction stayed with her. Walter had not been protecting numbers on a payroll sheet. Every amount represented food on someone's table and bills waiting at home. When the company failed, those workers would have been the easiest people to tell there was nothing left. Walter refused to let them absorb the loss. Rachel walked outside for a moment. The clearing was still scarred by rain. Cabins leaned beneath moss. The saw shed was collapsing. Nothing about Alder Creek looked like the remains of a fortune. That had been the point she kept missing. Walter could have protected himself. He could have kept his savings and his equipment. Instead, he had finished paying men whose labor had already been spent. Rachel thought about Mercer Repair and the anger she had carried since the creditor's representative put inventory stickers on Daniel's tools. She had judged her father by what he failed to preserve. The building was gone, so Daniel had failed. The money was gone, so Walter had failed. But Walter's missing money had not vanished through carelessness. It had become wages in the hands of families who had earned them. Daniel had understood enough of that story to preserve Alder Creek's purchase right, even when the camp itself seemed worthless. Neither man had left Rachel wealth. They had left something harder to put on a balance sheet. Sophie joined her outside. "You don't have to make Walter perfect because he did one good thing," she said. Rachel smiled faintly. "I know. And understanding Daniel doesn't mean you can't still be angry about the shop." Rachel looked toward the workshop. "I think I was angry because I thought losing it meant everything Dad built disappeared." "Do you still think that?" Rachel considered her grease-stained hands. She remembered repairing the generator when the road was blocked. hearing Daniel's instructions in her head. No. Back inside. Eli had found several final pages stuck together near the back of Walter's notebook. Most contained ordinary figures. Rachel separated them carefully. On the last written page, Walter had totaled the remaining payroll. Beneath it, every worker's name had eventually been crossed through after payment. At the bottom was a sentence rather than another calculation. Rachel leaned closer. "What does it say?" Eli asked. She read aloud. "A man's wages belong to his family before they belong to any company." No one spoke for several seconds. Beneath the sentence, Walter had written one final word: protected. Rachel looked around the abandoned workshop. Gavin's offer was still folded inside her jacket. She could sell Alder Creek. She could keep it. Either choice now carried consequences. And history could not pay her bills. But for the first time, those no longer felt like the only two possibilities. Walter had looked at a dying logging camp and asked what could still be protected. Daniel had looked at the same forgotten property decades later and believed Rachel would know how to fix what looked finished. Rachel closed the notebook and rested her hand on its worn cover. She finally understood what Walter had saved. The question now was what she was going to save. Rachel called Gavin from Alder Creek the next morning. She stood outside Walter's workshop with Finn beside her while sunlight broke through the Douglas firs. "I'm not selling," she said. Gavin was quiet for a moment. "You're sure?" Rachel looked at the sagging sawshed, the moss-covered cabins, and the muddy road that had trapped her only days earlier. Nothing about keeping the property was practical in the easy sense. She still had no repair shop, little money, and more work here than she could afford. "Yes." "All right," Gavin said. There was no threat or argument. "Then the offer's withdrawn. Good luck with it." Rachel folded his written offer that afternoon and put it into Daniel's folder. Refusing the money did not solve anything. Alder Creek still needed repairs, and Rachel refused to turn Walter's story into an excuse for pretending those problems did not exist. Sophie helped contact families connected to the worker records, asking permission before sharing anything personal. Word traveled quietly. The first person to visit was the grandson of a former truck driver. He brought lumber from his own property. Another family paid for roofing material. A retired carpenter volunteered 2 weekends. None of the contributions were enormous. That made them feel more meaningful to Rachel. People were giving what they could because someone at Alder Creek had once done the same for their families. Eli became the most consistent presence. He arrived most mornings with coffee, tools, and opinions Rachel rarely requested. Together they chose the old workshop as the first building worth saving. Roof before walls. Eli said, "Drainage before paint. You think I've never repaired a building? I think you repaired engines. Engines complain less. So do buildings if you fix them right." Sophie arranged for the worker records to be properly preserved. The original receipts and payroll documents would remain protected rather than displayed as curiosities. Rachel agreed immediately. Walter had buried them to preserve proof, not to expose families. The steel toolbox itself stayed in the workshop after Rachel cleaned away the mud and loose rust. She never polished out every dent. Those belonged to its history. By early spring, the workshop roof no longer leaked, the wiring was safe, the generator had become backup rather than necessity, and Rachel installed a used workbench opposite Walter's original one. She drove back to where she had stored her remaining belongings and retrieved the wooden Mercer repair sign she had removed on the day the creditors took Daniel's shop. Eli helped her hang it on the wall. Beneath it stood Walter's scarred bench. WH still visible in the corner, Rachel stepped backward and looked at the two names sharing the same room without needing to become the same story. She did not reopen a full repair business overnight. She started small. Chainsaws, generators, pumps, small logging equipment. machines people around Millhaven depended on and could bring up the road in a pickup. The first months were uneven. Some weeks brought enough work to cover expenses, others did not. Rachel learned to price carefully because generosity without survival would only close another shop. On one wall, she mounted a simple wooden plaque Sophie helped her design. Alder Creek wages paid in full. Nothing underneath named the workers. Their families already knew who they were. Gavin stopped by once in early summer while inspecting nearby land. He looked around the repaired workshop and nodded toward the Mercer repair sign. So this was the plan? There wasn't a plan. Rachel wiped grease from her hands. There is now. He accepted that answer and left without mentioning the sale again. Months passed. Alder Creek remained rough around the edges, but it no longer felt abandoned. One cool morning, Eli arrived carrying an old chainsaw. "Not mine," he said, placing it on Rachel's bench. "Young logger outside town. Just had a baby. Saw quit yesterday, and he needs it working before the next job." Rachel pulled the starter cord. "Nothing. What can he pay?" Eli hesitated. "Not much right now." Rachel looked at him. "You brought it here because you knew that, possibly." She shook her head, but opened the housing. The problem took 2 hours. Damaged fuel line, fouled plug, carburetor clogged badly enough to starve the engine. When Rachel finally pulled the cord again, the saw came alive in a clean mechanical roar. Finn lifted his head from beneath Walter's workbench and then went back to sleep. The young logger arrived that afternoon. He tested the saw outside, relief spreading across his face when the engine held steady. "What do I owe you?" Rachel named. "The normal cost of the parts," then watched his expression change. "I can get you some of it Friday," he said. "Maybe the rest after the next job." Months earlier. Rachel might have heard those words as a warning. She knew what unpaid invoices could do to a business. Daniel had taught her that too, even if he had not always followed his own advice perfectly. She glanced toward Walter's steel toolbox. Generosity did not mean pretending money was unnecessary. Walter's lesson had never been that work should be free. It was that wages already earned belonged to the people who depended on them. Rachel pushed the repaired chainsaw toward the man. "Pay me when you're working again. I don't want charity." "Good. Because it isn't charity. I'm sending you an invoice." He laughed uncertainly. "You trust me?" Rachel looked at the machine between them. "I trust that you need this to earn the money you're going to pay me with." He thanked her, loaded the saw into his truck, and drove away. Rachel returned to the workbench and opened the new notebook she used for repair jobs. She wrote his name, the parts, the amount due, and the date. Her pen paused. Across the room hung Daniel's Mercer repair sign. Beneath it stood Walter's bench. Rachel had once believed inheritance meant whatever remained after someone died, property. Money, tools, debts. Daniel had left her no building. Walter had left no fortune. Yet both men had left behind choices that continued long after their possessions were gone. Rachel finally understood that losing the old shop had not erased what Daniel gave her. His skills live in her hands. His faith that she could fix what looked finished had brought her here. Walter had left something different the measure of what those skills were for. Outside, wind moved through the Oregon firs. Alder Creek would never become a monument to a perfect family. It was simply a working place again, where things that looked finished sometimes got another chance. Rachel looked down at the unpaid invoice. Then beside the amount due, she wrote the same word Walter had once written beside the wages of men whose families needed them. "Protecteth."